Hi, my name's Phil and welcome to LabourVision, where we talk about an aspect of Labour policy. And in this video, I'm going to discuss Labour's proposed amendment to the King's Speech regarding the conflict in Israel and Palestine, why people opposing it don't seem to have read it, and what Keir Starmer has said recently about his efforts to move towards a lasting peace. So there's a few aspects to this. The first is that the SNP presented a motion famously last week which called for an immediate ceasefire. Keir Starmer explained that to call for an immediate ceasefire is to call for Israel to abandon its hostages and accept Hamas still firing rockets into Israel. Not really much of a ceasefire. So instead, Labour proposed an amendment which contained the following action points: that Israel and Hamas and similar groups comply with all international humanitarian laws, that hospitals be protected, that siege conditions of Gaza be lifted, that supplies of food, water, electricity, medicines and fuel be secured, that Gazan residents be allowed to return to their homes, that the expansion of illegal settlements be ended, that settler violence in the West Bank be addressed, and that there be humanitarian pauses which are long enough to actually get civilians in Gaza the help they need. Now, on that last point, there are reports that we may be close to this in return for the release of Israeli hostages. Now, if this happens, then in my mind, it will be immensely helpful in two ways politically. First, it means an actual ceasefire, although not a lasting one, but then ceasefires don't last. Hence why it's pointless to keep calling for one, when what you should be calling for is a lasting peace. Second, if there are no more hostages in Gaza, then justification for the siege is much diminished. Yes, Israel still has the right to make sure Hamas cannot fire rockets into Israel, but it doesn't really justify flattening an entire city. You know, the reason Hamas took hostages and then announced that it intended to carry out October 7th style attacks repeatedly in the future, that was designed to give, Israel the green light, the red rag I meant in this case, that they needed to wade in mob-handed. They knew in Netanyahu they had an absolute lunatic who would have no respect for the people of Gaza or international law. But if there are no more hostages, then the only justification the Israeli government have left is dealing with future threats. And it will be harder to support, as I say, flattening Gaza to do that. It will then be easier to call for a longer lasting ceasefire, though even that will need something to make sure that it doesn't just last a few weeks. For example, why aren't international peacekeepers involved in this? This always seems to be absent. The Labour amendment also called for the release of all hostages and the cessation of fighting, which, if you don't think that's a ceasefire, what do you actually think a ceasefire is? But theirs wasn't just, we want a pause before more fighting a few weeks later. Theirs was, we want this followed up by immediate diplomatic efforts to implement the two-state solution and get a lasting peace. In fact, for those who say that Labour's amendment did not go far enough, I get a strange silence when I ask people, so what did it miss out then? What wasn't in there? Oh, there's no ceasefire. It says, yes, there is. It says cessation of fighting. What sort of infant says, oh, but it didn't use the word ceasefire, you see? The reality is it contained everything the SNP amendment contained and more. The SNP amendment did not call for a lasting peace. It called for an immediate ceasefire. But a ceasefire isn't peace. There was a ceasefire in place on October the 7th until it was broken. The next ceasefire, if that's all that happens, we've got a ceasefire, we're very happy now, we'll just go away and worry about our own things. If that's all that happens, that'll be broken again by one side or the other in the future, not even the distant future. It's strange to me that people who support the call for an immediate ceasefire, which still allows Hamas to keep the hostages and for them to continue firing rockets into Israel, claim to be campaigning for peace, when they openly attack the Labour amendment, which calls for the actual route to genuine peace. It has all the material action points that the SNP amendment had, plus more. What we have here is a classic situation of deliberate misinformation. Nobody trying to whip up public feeling on either side has any interest in reporting on the available options. The people who marched through Starmer's constituency had not read Starmer's amendment. Because what is in it which you would object to? What is there that you would object to if you want civilians in both Israel and Palestine to live peaceful lives? And what was in their preferred amendment which helps those civilians live a peaceful life? Because a ceasefire isn't peace. A ceasefire is a period of time maybe a few days, maybe a few weeks, maybe a few months, if you're lucky, when there are no attacks on your homes. A ceasefire is war with respite. It's really this simple. Anyone who was genuinely campaigning for peace would be doing the following. First, they'd be calling for the diplomatic efforts towards the two-state solution. That would be the main focus of your campaign. Second, they'd be presenting their ideas to the government, not just the opposition. Because isn't that a bit weird when people are like campaigning specifically against Labour or Labour MPs, but not Conservatives who are actually in government, who actually decide the UK's diplomatic response? Now, let me be clear. The vast majority of people taking part in these protests are, of course, genuinely interested in peace. That is evident. But where they're getting their information from, who they're listening to, they're not listening to Keir Starmer. Like I said, they've absolutely not read his amendment. They've not listened to what he's had to say about it. They're listening to those who've been supporting genocide around the world for decades. People who turned a blind eye to Russia's genocide in Syria and Ukraine, or China's oppression of the Uyghurs. Many of those speaking to these people are not peaceful. They don't advocate peace. They advocate for one side laying down their arms and calling that peace. But what they mean is the other side just run roughshod over them. Whereas, as Starmer explained, he's actually engaging diplomatically with international partners to work towards a lasting peace. He actually said in an interview, I'll link it in the description below, that he's not interested in party unity on this. He's interested in the people suffering in Israel and Gaza. So he's taking what practical steps he can, which is diplomatic steps. The last thing some of the agitators involved want is peace. Because if there were peace, how on earth would they grift their millions then? The reality on the ground is this. The UK government, and certainly the UK government in waiting, has no power to enforce a ceasefire, temporary or permanent. If it were possible for the UK to impose peace on the region, then obviously, yes, that would be different. Of course, we should certainly do that. But we don't. We don't have any power. What we have is words we can try and persuade. But we lose even that power if stakeholders won't listen to us. We can't go around the world making demands. If we were to go into stand on any international platform and begin with the words I demand or we demand, we'd be laughed at and then ignored. If we want to be heard, we also have to listen. We have to engage. We cannot do so from a position of arrogance. The only good the UK can possibly do in this situation is adding our diplomatic efforts towards a peace that lasts. This is what Starmer is arguing. It's what Labour's amendment is arguing for. Show me an alternative to Labour's amendment which actually called for a lasting peace or proposed any of the steps to a lasting peace. Because I saw 3 proposed amendments on this issue and only Labour's called for peace. And yet somehow this means Starmer, the human rights lawyer who travelled the world saving people from death sentences, has blood on his hands. Do me a favour. And finally, I want to address some Islamophobic comments that keep flying around as well. Some people think that the Labour MPs who rebelled against the whip were doing so for fear of losing Muslim votes in their constituencies. Now, if this were actually the case, then those Labour MPs are fairly dim and maybe even a bit racist. Now, I don't believe that. Because the idea that Muslims vote as a hive mind based on some Muslim-based policy, that's actually Islamophobic. Muslims are not just Muslims. They're doctors, teachers, road workers, restaurateurs, pilots, librarians, everything that everyone else is. They're football fans or rugby fans or cricket fans or opera fans. They like foreign holidays or they hate foreign holidays. They're rich or the poor or somewhere in between. In short, they're people who have a particular faith, but they're people. When it comes to voting, they vote as people making their own minds up. A recent poll from Savanta showed that 64% of Muslims are going to vote for Labour. 19% going to vote for the Conservatives. And this poll was conducted at the end of October and beginning of November, so before Labour's position had evolved to even this stage. Basically, what we have here is we've got some groups taking advantage of people to try and convince them to keep the Tories in power so they can continue their selfish Game of Thrones within the Labour Party. Just like the Tories persuaded people to vote for Brexit and are now trying to persuade people to vote away their very human rights. But there we are. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for listening, and until next time, I'll see you later.